Well, welcome back. My name is Dixie Johnson. I'm the vice chair of the Institute, and I'm really pleased to be part of the leadership of this institute. We started planning at least 9 months ago and have been watching the rule proposals roll out ever since. And so we're very glad to be here. Thank you for joining us today. The next panel is always a favorite because it allows us to kind of get insights into what the general counsels of public companies are thinking about today, what their challenges are for the in-house counsel folks that run our public companies. At least that's my view as to who runs the public companies. The session chair is Tom Kim. Tom is our institute chair. You've already heard from him. He's a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Tom is a member of the Securities Regulation and Corporate Governance Practice Group at Gibson Dunn, and he focuses his practice, as a lot of you know, on a broad range of SEC disclosure and regulatory matters. Tom has served as a trusted advisor to general counsels. We're very excited to have him here. And he also was chief counsel in the Division of Corporation Finance, and I've known him for a long time. Is your ribbon older than mine?
2000s.
No, we're about the same. Anyway, if you haven't gotten a chance to know Tom, please take a moment. During this year, while we've been planning the Institute, Tom also has worked on many rule proposals, comments, so that the rules that roll out are informed by what happens in the marketplace. He also is a special friend and has really given a lot to this institute over the last 3 years, especially during times when we couldn't be here in person. So I'm very glad we're here for the 50th anniversary together. One more time, please scooch in and free up the chairs so that other people can come in and sit. And thank you. I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Dixie. Can I just say that the last 25 minutes have been magical. Just like chit-chatting, getting to see people again, people that you haven't seen in years. I think that's the real reason why we worked so hard to make this institute in person as opposed to virtual. So I'm happy to moderate the first session of the day, which is the General Counsel Speak, Looking Ahead. And why don't I quickly introduce my speakers. Their full bios and titles are in the programs. To my left is Carrie McLean, the General Counsel of Intuit. To her left is Lanisha Minnix, the General Counsel of Ecolab. To her left is Scott Morgan, the General Counsel of Splunk. And to his left is Dana Wagner, the General Counsel of Twilio. Now, each of these speakers, even though their remarks will be informed by their experience at their employers, each is speaking for him or herself and not on behalf of their respective companies. So, this has been an intense several years of rulemaking at the SEC. 2020, when we last met in person, would be the last year of a Republican majority SEC as led by Jay Clayton. And notwithstanding the fact that the SEC was working remotely that year, as I think all of us were, 2020 was marked by a lot of accomplishment by the SEC. The SEC adopted final rules with respect to financial statement requirements for guarantors, as well as for acquired and disposed businesses, amendments to the definition of accelerated filer and large accelerated filer, as well as the definition of accredited investor, new requirements for proxy advisory firms, updates to SK items 101, 103, 105, including the principles-based human capital management disclosure requirement, and of course, at the end of the year, to item 303 MD&A. We saw also final amendments to Rule 1488, amendments to the auditor independence standards, and amendments to the private offering rules, among others. So even though some of these final rules were adopted along party lines, I think in general, the public company community supported these rules. So for example, the SX amendments on financial statements, those are certainly a welcome development for public companies. When the transition to a new administration occurred in late January of 2021, at the time of our first virtual institute, I think the public company community knew that there was a dramatic change in order. I think one of the first things that Acting Chair Allison Lee did when she became Acting Chair, one of her first HR actions was to appoint a senior policy advisor for climate and ESG. At the time, I think that seemed to all of us watching that was a very telling signal as to what was to come. And sure enough, once Chair Gary Gensler was appointed as chair in April of 2021, the SEC, now Democratic majority, started systematically to undo many of the Clayton Commission's final rules, such as, for example, the new requirements for proxy advisory firms. And it would take them the rest of the year to kickstart their agenda, which they really did in earnest in 2022. So we are now 2 years into the Gensler Commission, and I think I speak for everybody in saying that the regulatory environment for public companies feels pretty intense right now. You know, shortly before the Institute met virtually last January, the SEC had proposed rule amendments on share repurchases and 10b5-1. The share repurchase rule proposal would require daily reporting of share repurchases, and the 10b5-1 proposal proposed a 120-day cooling-off period for officers and directors. And shortly after our institute last January, the SEC proposed rule amendments on cybersecurity, which would propose an 8K reporting for material cybersecurity breaches, and of course, the climate change disclosure rule proposal. Our next session will discuss in depth the climate change rule proposal, but obviously in a word, it's massive. Also in 2022, the SEC finally finished the Dodd-Frank rulemakings on pay versus performance and on clawback, and at the end of last year, it pushed the 10b5-1 rule proposal forward to adoption. So many of the sessions in this institute will discuss these rulemaking projects and the practical implications for companies. According to the fall 2022 RegFlex agenda, which was recently announced, coming up in 2023 will be rule proposals on corporate board diversity, human capital management, and more cybersecurity, in addition to moving climate change and 8K reporting for cybersecurity to the final rule stage. So clearly the SEC has 3 solid Democrat votes for its agenda, so it is likely that the rule proposals in one form or another will become final rules in 2023. So I said it at the outset, I think this is as dynamic a regulatory environment that I've seen at the SEC in many years. And I think it's particularly striking because there is no congressional mandate for the SEC to implement. So in the past 20, 25 years, we've seen Sarbanes-Oxley, we've seen Dodd-Frank, we've seen the Jobs Act. Here, none of that is, the SEC is not really reacting to any congressional mandate. It really is just simply implementing and driving its own agenda. To add on top of this, obviously we're in a very challenging macro environment right now. In 2022, we saw inflation and historic increases in interest rates. We saw supply chain issues, a significant decline in the stock market, and of course, we're dealing with the tail end of the pandemic and the collateral consequences stemming from Ukraine. So all in all, it's a challenging time for public companies, and for this reason, we wanted to kick off this 50th Anniversary Institute with a roundtable discussion with the general counsels. After all, you're the ones who are responsible for your company's compliance with the law, and so we're very interested in your perspectives on the SEC's agenda. So why don't we get started with our first topic, which is the compliance environment. Obviously, in the ideal world, there would be no shortage of staff or of resources or of time, but that is not the real world. So to the panel, sort of what in concrete terms is the compliance environment like right now in January of 2023?
Well, let me just start by thanking the Institute for having me and having us here today. I'm thrilled to be here to have this discussion. So I'll start with talent as it relates to compliance. And Tom did a very good job of summing up the various challenges that our legal departments are facing right now. And I know we're going to have a rich discussion about it. But obviously, as leaders, I would be remiss if I didn't just talk about the fact that in order to comply with all of these various compliance issues and regulatory agencies, you need good people. And the way that you can deliver on this is having good people in your department. And I know many of my colleagues will have the same issue, but obviously budgets are not getting larger every year. A lot of the macroeconomic conditions that we're facing requires us to be very prudent with the resources. And so you have to really make sure that you're getting and keeping and attracting and retaining the right talent and people in the organization that have the expertise and the skills and the experiences that you need. And so that is what I spend a majority or a lot of my time on. obviously is making sure that as a general counsel that our companies are thinking about the right things, but that I've got the right people either internally or frankly as an extension of my internal team externally through my outside law firms to make sure that we can deliver that. And so I would just be remiss if it didn't talk about the team first, and how we need to have good, strong teams in order to deliver on this ever-changing compliance environment, which I know we're going to spend some time talking about today.
I would echo that. Also, just echo, it's wonderful to be back here and to be back here in person, and thanks to the Institute and everyone involved in organizing this. I think when we were talking about talent, from this perspective, it feels both broader and narrower in some ways than it did before. Broader in the sense that, post-COVID, more remote working options, it's opened up access to hiring people in different areas, easier access to different populations. I think we're seeing more diversity in our talent pipeline overall, which is a positive, but there's areas when there's sudden spikes or there's been gradual buildup in spikes for the demands for certain types of specialized talent, and that creates a run on that form of talent. So if suddenly you're worried about your resilience to cybersecurity risks in certain areas, then people who are good in that area, at least who are known quantities in those areas, become in high demand. And it's similar to what we saw with financial sophistication on audit committees and things like that before, both at management board levels. We're seeing that in some of these other areas that are now an increased focus for public companies to have plans around and disclose against.
Yeah, I'd say, it's almost, and maybe this is old news, but I think legal departments at public companies are becoming mini law firms in the sense of the scope, breadth, and depth of the areas that we cover. The talent market, I think, continues to be very, very tight for those really specialized skills. I think having remote workers has opened up, as Dana said, opportunity both for different areas to harvest talent, but also diversity. But I would say, sort of, in my experience, you have employees looking for not just benefits and pay these days, but purpose. And that really is where we're focusing and trying to spend a lot of time to distinguish ourselves as employers, both in sort of what we provide that particular attorney or legal professional, or what we do as a company and how we interact with the world. And I know we're going to get into some of the rule proposals, which I think touch on this as well.
I think the other piece I think it's important is it's not just legal talent, it's talent actually across the organization. And that talent, trying to actually find folks who can manage such a broad organizational effort like ESG, like climate change, because it requires all of that talent across the organization. And it's not necessarily something that exists today. And so it's folks who are willing to actually take that on as a new career, because it really is a different skill set that we're requiring now.
Well, now that we see climate change, obviously, it's not only in the horizon, but it's getting bigger. And when I have dealt with clients on ESG issues, it hasn't actually been the legal team. It's like a public relations communications team. It's a team filled with people who have graduate degrees in various subject matters, but they're not lawyers. So knowing that we have and potentially 10K reporting on climate change, are you as leaders of your legal organization starting to recruit for climate change? And how do you actually assess expertise in these issues? Because I think everybody is saying, hey, I'm a climate change expert, and you just scratch that surface and you realize that they took a course. Or, how do you think through how to staff up to anticipate what is clearly coming down the pike in terms of climate change and other types of disclosures that are not traditionally seen in an SEC filing?
I think it requires this cross-functional team. So we have folks in our organization who are really good at reporting, who are really good at controls, but we have to work across the organization, because we're not going to necessarily hire somebody in the legal department who's a climate change expert. It really is more around a reporting expert, somebody who can actually work across and create a team and drive that initiative across the organization, which is another skill that is actually quite challenging often for lawyers. But I think it's one that we're going to, because it requires so many disciplines, you have to have somebody who can work across the organization.
So I would argue that it's so intimately tied to what it is that we do as a legal department that actually having sustainability, particularly through ESG, there's incredible synergy. It can go in a lot of different places, but in our instance, we've been able to put it with the legal team, which has been hugely beneficial because it's educated us as legal professionals And then we've been able to influence the climate side and the ESG side, which has been very powerful. And our lawyers today, our in-house lawyers and legal professionals, obviously they're legal professionals, they're legal experts, but they really are trying to project manage as well, and they're trying to look across the organization. This is not something we've all been trained to do, and so it's a new muscle. And when we get to talking about law firms and how law firms can help, I would sort of focus a bit there as well. It is, you think about these issues that we're talking about, they're super cross-functional. They don't necessarily fall into a legal domain yet. There has to be somebody leading it, and often because it's a regulation or a law, the lawyers are going to be expected, or the Office of the General Counsel is going to be expected to push that forward.
Yeah. And it's such a good point, because one of the things that we spend a lot of time focused on is the ability to be able to collaborate, but also the ability to think like a business person as well, because you have to be able to communicate some incredibly complicated regulatory issues and challenges to people that don't read regulations every day, and right, so that ability to be able to communicate and again work cross-functionally across the organization is very, very critical. Because if you come into a situation where you understand the regulations and you may be the expert, but you can't communicate it to the various other stakeholders, you're at a bit of a disadvantage. So it's a pretty important skill.
Yeah, it's a new muscle, as Scott said, but it's a familiar trope, right? You're telling a story to various stakeholders about what your company means and represents in the world with respect to a certain area of concerns. And I think as attorneys, as advocates, we're used to taking subject matter expertise and trying to line that up with different disclosure standards, different stakeholder concerns. How do you translate that from the perspective of your sustainability subject matter expert, who may not think that all the disclosure requirements or some of the metrics or criteria being used necessarily line up with their view of what sustainability means, but how do you take their expertise and translate that into a narrative that does line up with the expectations of your internal crowd, tells a narrative about why your company is doing what it's doing and why you should believe in that, and make that resonate with the audiences. That's something we do in a host of areas. This is sort of a new area in which to apply that muscle. It does require different people. It is very cross-functional, as everyone says, but that's a pattern that we recognize as people who are in these seats.
I love that concept of a narrative or storytelling. We try and contextualize it, because otherwise I think there's immediate resistance versus explaining the rationale. And we'll talk about how boards interact with regulations and executive teams, but this really is the way to do that. And I think there is this concept of the stakeholder economy, which allows a lot of air cover to have those types of conversations. Anyway, I think that's such a powerful way to think about how to introduce this to our companies, where it's actually not just a legal function, it is something that's more broadly incorporated into the operations of the company.
Well, and if I can, to piggyback off of that, I think one of the things that lawyers are incredibly good at is thinking across multiple stakeholder groups, because we have visibility that maybe others within the organization don't have. And so thinking about the investor perspective, but also the customer perspective, the employee perspective, there's the regulatory perspective. And I think lawyers are particularly good at sort of looking at that multi-stakeholder approach and being able to help our business counterparts think about things in terms of that narrative that you talked about.
I mean, to that end, where is, when we think about your legal teams and their ability to tell these stories, to sort of exercise these new muscles, where does diversity, equity, inclusion, where is that on your list of priorities when you recruit, and how does that manifest itself in that process, and how does that sort of, fit into what we've been saying so far?
For us, it's a huge priority. And I think, we've had such a great opportunity given COVID to sort of hire from lots of different areas and be able to actually build up folks who may not have been able to actually be in where we are, California, to actually join our team. And I think it also provides just an opportunity for the company to actually develop a whole new practice with new perspectives where we didn't have it before. And it becomes an area for folks to actually develop real expertise and leadership.
Yeah, I would, so obviously it's something we all aspire to evolve. I think we all find ourselves in this situation where we know, things need to change, but it's so far beyond that. It really is sort of the value set of the company, if it's truly incorporated, and then it becomes part of the purpose, which I think, again, in order to attract talent, you have to have a compelling story beyond what you're paying people. So it's almost foundational to a company's existence, in my view. And it's gone well beyond diversity, equity, inclusion, I think, is one of the more critical elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say as an organization that operates in over 170 countries around the world, it's mission critical for us, right? We're a truly global company, and so if you have to build diverse and inclusive teams if you want to drive the right financial performance. And so, to Scott's point, it's not only just about, doing it because it's the right thing to do, but it's a business imperative that you have to deliver. And Carrie makes a good point around, what we found post-COVID is that, there's a broader opportunity to deploy talent no matter where they are in the world, which allows you to build diverse teams more effectively than maybe even pre-COVID. I mean, return to work has added some challenges to that, but it's, DE&I is such an important part of an organization, and it has to be fundamental to who you are as a company. And it really is what people are looking for now is purpose. How important is it? I mean, part of the reason I'm fairly new to Ecolab, but part of the compelling story of why I picked this company was because it leads with its values, and it's a purpose-driven organization. And I think my story is similar to lots of people of why they join the organizations that they join.
It's a value. It has to start at the top. It has to be core to the company. It ripples throughout. We were talking about competition for talent earlier, and certainly, more remote hiring options has opened up other pools of talent, made them more accessible. But the talent has more options also. They're able to join different companies, different organizations more easily, and it's increasingly an expectation of that talent you're competing for, that you have something good to say about this. And I mean, Lanisha just spoke to it. I mean, it's something that people at all levels evaluate when deciding whether to join. If you do it well, it tends to snowball and attract more people and be more. But if you do it poorly, I think you're going to be at a disadvantage.
Why don't we switch gears and talk about the regulatory state beyond the SEC? Obviously, this session is about the SEC, but we would be remiss if we didn't discuss the fact that, as public company general counsels, you deal with multiple agencies, both at the federal and at the state level. The SEC's agenda is actually only part of a larger agenda being pushed by the Biden administration throughout the executive branch. So what are the other agencies that you spend a lot of time on, and why? And what should your outside securities counsel or corporate counsel or litigator know about these other agencies and their agendas and how that's impacting your companies and the way you're thinking about how to solve problems that at first blush look only like a securities problem, but there are actually all these other dimensions to it that you're also dealing with?
I was just going to start by saying it's actually not just the regulatory agencies. It's customers, it's employees that are sort of driving a narrative where it may be a requirement on the regulatory side, but it's almost an imperative from a customer or an employee perspective. DE&I is a good example of that, for example. But I do think the broader context of ESG becomes super important when we're talking about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the SEC being part of the regulatory tapestry and part of an overall administrative, imperative. We certainly see that with, climate change. I mean, here, today we'll be talking about some of the SEC rulemaking in that area, but there's a 2021 executive order calling upon all agencies to get involved in fighting climate change, and we see similar patterns and interest from the FTC, from other agencies. I mean, it depends on your business model. We have a telecommunications platform at my company, so we work with the Federal Communications Commission a lot. We're very engaged with data regulators and commissions internationally. But it's important for our external counsel and our internal teams on the securities and corporate issues to know how that does inform how we're thinking about risk and how we're thinking about what our regulatory profile is, how what mitigation plans we need, what contingency plans we need, and what the risk analysis for the business is. It all feeds into that.
Yeah, I think Carrie and I were chuckling before. Again, operating in 170 countries, it's like, how much time do we have to talk about the various regulatory implications of our business? And I'd say, obviously, the regulatory agencies in the U.S. have been incredibly active in driving forward a very important agenda across multiple agencies, and we are very focused on that. Our lawmakers in the U.S. and in various states are also keenly focused on driving forward their agenda, and outside of the U.S. as well. And so, part of what we're trying to do is figure out, obviously, how we can make sure we not only comply with this, but we manage the risk appropriately, and that we have the resources, the arms and legs in all these various jurisdictions to make sure that we can, in fact, comply with the various rules as they come out, and understand, importantly, the impacts to our business and how we can, manage those most effectively.
Yeah, it feels like between data, cybersecurity, crypto, all the areas that our teams are dealing with, there is, a regulatory agency that's beginning to focus on, or multiple regulatory agencies that are fighting to figure out who's going to be regulating that. And so, we have a lot of resources that are directed at actually helping and figuring out how we can ensure that we are staying ahead of compliance. One of the things I think our teams really worked hard is, especially around things like ESG, is trying to stay ahead of where we need to be, so that when the regulations actually come out, we're not so far away from what we need to do to be compliant. And so, but as that multiplies across multiple agencies, I think it becomes an enormous effort for our teams, as well as other teams across the company, to ensure that we're sort of on top of and staying ahead of where the regulatory agencies are headed. And so when you cross that across multiple countries and 50 states, it's a huge endeavor.
And Tom, as a technology company, obviously, Carrie said it, data sovereignty, data localization is incredibly important. Cybersecurity, as I mentioned, we have customers demanding this, including the U.S. government through executive orders, and is insisting on secure development lifecycle for software companies, which will affect, frankly, every company, because every company is deploying some level or developing with some level of software, which includes some sort of bill of materials, software bill of materials. Then that rule is coming soon. But even further down that chain, just think about labor, and the balance of power between employees and companies is fundamentally changing around the world. Whether it's unions or some of the work that I think just came out of the FTC with non-competes, there's this balance of power that's changing that I think you can see in laws. But if we, to the point that Carrie made, can get further upstream and anticipate those, it's easier to manage. But they're coming from a lot of different places.
Yeah, and I think Carrie's point about the state regulatory agencies initiatives is a very important one. Over and over again, we're seeing areas, privacy, cybersecurity. If there's perceived by the states as slow or insufficient, inadequate action at the federal level, we're seeing more aggression and more activism by states to come in with their own laws, and that's an understandable thing. It creates a risk of sort of patchwork of different, maybe inconsistent rules and regulations in these places. But I'm spending more time than I would have anticipated a few years ago looking at state regulatory initiatives and trends there, and that's increasingly important.
Well, let's complicate the picture even more and think also about sort of geopolitical change, which is happening, right now. I think the COVID pandemic made very clear the dangers of having to rely on imported goods for key materials like PPE and silicon chips. And geopolitically, I think it's becoming clear that the open globalist world order that we thought was here to stay in the early 2000s is not, in fact, inevitable. And so, adding on top of sort of the dynamic that Dana was talking about between states and federal, now we have geopolitically how are companies dealing with this trend of borders coming back up, and what does that mean for the legal department, and how is it impacting how you communicate with shareholders and how your board thinks about these issues, knowing that as a country there are sort of geopolitical dynamics that as key actors in the economy that you'll have to deal with as general counsels.
I'm happy to start. It's as easy as ever these days. So, look, I think organizations, ours included, are really focused on what we call resilient supply chains, and making sure that we can continue to deliver reliably to our customers around the world. And then you have to take geopolitical issues into account. You have to take into account where your employees are, where your facilities are, where your customers are. There's all kinds of trade implications around that. A few years ago, everyone was talking about globalization and having these global supply chains. And now you're starting to see almost the reverse post-COVID of everyone's wanting things delivered, manufactured locally. And so there's this kind of nationalization. And you've got to be able to operate a business and deliver for your customers with this ever-changing macro environment. Our legal department is right in the middle of it and focused on making sure that we can support the business facing all of these challenges. And, fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of times the regulations in various countries conflict. And so you have to, kind of thread the needle to make sure that you are managing risk appropriately, but also complying with the laws in various countries when, it's incredibly nuanced. And you've got differing regulatory requirements. And you take Ukraine, Russia, for example, trying to manage a business when the EU has one set of sanctions, the US has one set of sanctions, and then there's laws coming out of other parts of the world. And so, you've got to manage all of that, but ultimately the key is to continue to deliver for your customers and making sure that you're doing that in a way that manages the risk most effectively.
I think that's extremely well said. I think 5-10 years ago, when you talked about your supply chain, when you talked about how you were setting up to succeed and grow, it was almost singularly a focus on efficiency and diversification, and now there's this focus on resilience, as you said, and that means different things now, given geopolitical risk, than it used to, and the Ukrainian war was one big wake-up call for that. You see it with a lot of the domestic legislative agenda, with the Chips and Science Act, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. These things are changing ideas about what you can rely on and where you can be doing business, and in the boardroom and the audit committee, you're seeing a lot more questions about your enterprise risk management program. Are you thinking about black swan events? Are you predicting and prepared to mitigate things that are inherently unpredictable and difficult to anticipate? And we're hearing those questions from investors and analysts as well. I'm hearing a lot more questions about exposure to geopolitical risk than I did before. So again, it's a new muscle, but it's a familiar trope. Like we're used to sort of incorporating new types of concerns and risks and figuring out how to put them into a risk management framework. But this has definitely received increased interest, and I think that will continue.
This is where I think government affairs within the company can be incredibly helpful. And there's this new sort of, we talk about geopolitics in our meetings so that we're surfacing these things. And it's where I think the legal team can deliver tremendous value, business value, if you can anticipate these things happening and you can look ahead. A lot of these, I think, are seen increasingly, particularly in the fractionalized geopolitical world, as zero sum. I'll give you an example. It became clear several years ago that the US and China were headed to some sort of collision. Fortunately, so far it's not been kinetic, but at this point it's not a great relationship, and supply chains have been severely disrupted. And we, in our instance, decided to pull back. We had a small footprint, so we were able to do this, our research and development activities there, knowing that we developed software, knowing that the US government, as a large customer of ours, didn't find that necessarily a great fact when they were looking at our software. So now that's come full circle, and the executive order I mentioned will actually put a very bright light on this. But this is where I think we can add tremendous value trying to look ahead. And I'm happy to share another story on Russia. Something similar in terms of where we saw that there was no real opportunity there as it related to our business, very particular to our facts and circumstances as a company. We decided to take a step back from Russia 4 or 5 years ago. Of course, we look like geniuses today. And that was driven by understanding, the lawyers understanding the business imperatives, knowing that we could take the opportunity to sort of infer an expensive compliance overhead. And then it became an easy business decision with a lot of geopolitical and legal input.
All right, so let's start focusing on sort of the SEC's agenda, but let's start first with managing cybersecurity. It's not inherently an SEC issue, and yet, as we know, the SEC has proposed to make it the subject of 8K reporting. Before we talk about the SEC's rule proposal, from your standpoint as general counsels, what issues get raised from your standpoint when you're notified of a cybersecurity issue, and what are the various disciplines that get involved? And sort of to add on to that, how do you decide when to notify law enforcement and to what end, to what purpose are you notifying law enforcement? So so let's think about cybersecurity not from the standpoint of reporting, which is almost secondary or even third level, but in terms of the risk that it creates to the organization and how you as general counsels need to deal with so many different stakeholders as we've been talking about, because so many agencies, so many people are impacted when there is a cybersecurity breach.
Well, I'm happy to start. As a company that, part of our value is really around the data that we have and our ability to use that data to our customers' advantage. Cybersecurity is one of the most important things on our agenda. When there is a cybersecurity event, we have over the years developed playbooks and response plans that involve obviously the folks from cybersecurity, the folks from legal, and I have specialized folks in my organization who are directly aimed at the cybersecurity function, and so they have to have the expertise in that space in order to actually support that organization. We bring in finance, IT, risk management, and communications, because there's so many decisions that you have to make when you have a cybersecurity event. You really need the decision makers in the room in order to actually move forward. And so I think for us, this is it is a huge endeavor when this happens, because of the trust of our customers is so critical when something like this might happen.
Yeah, I mean, again, large, complex, multi-stakeholder, cross-functional area of concern for the company. That's something where the general counsel is going to be very involved and hopefully well equipped to marshal and lead that. It starts with the customer. I think when we have an incident, like what risk does this put our customers at? Are we preventing and containing that? But it's no longer just a technical issue the way I think you used to think about it is. Carrie mentioned communications, policy. There are reputational and business risks and parameters to this equation that weren't as prominent 10 years ago. But I think every company that is getting access to data and is doing things in the digital world, which is almost every company these days, you have to have this expertise, and you also have to, as general counsel, be able to be that bridge to your board and your audit committee, and they're going to have questions, both ongoing in terms of how are we managing this risk, and when there's an incident, what does this mean? Are we ahead of it? Are we coordinated the right ways? Do we have a response plan? Has it been? And I'm a big fan of tabletop exercises and similar training protocols with this. I think no plan survives first contact with the enemy, but you have to have a plan, and the best way to stress test it ahead of an actual event is to run scenarios and see how it works, and limits to that. But
So what prompts the call to the FBI? Is it the possibility that there's a state actor that is behind the attack? Sort of play out in terms of how you navigate your way through that initial contact from your IT desk to when you realize that the house is on fire and that you have to just start bringing in other actors that may even include going to the government.
Yeah, I would say there are obvious times. State actor would be one when you have certainty there, and certainty is really, really hard in an incident, and it's really, really hard to then conclude it's a breach. Like there are so many steps that you go through figuring this out. There are other areas where it's very ambiguous and other areas where you wouldn't want to bring them in. And I think that's where outside counsel can really help. More importantly, or as important, is having and outside counsel can help facilitate this, having a relationship with the FBI during peacetime. Have them come in, meet with you, get to know them. They'll even train your folks. They'll talk about geopolitical risks. If you're really brave, you can put them in front of the board. That can be a little scary because they are scary people at times, and they have a lot of information we don't. But that is, for me, the most critical part of the FBI is having that relationship and knowing who that person is that you can call. And they may or may not then, depending on who they are, have to follow up. But Tom, to your first question, I think of this as kind of a spectrum. There is what you do to prevent things, and there's a lot that you can do, and you have to have a robust program, and you have to prepare for the worst. There's the triaging an incident, whatever that is. we'll get into the reporting piece. It gets complicated because the fog of a cyber breach is very real, or an incident, not knowing what it's going to be. And then all the way through, how do you remediate, how do you get better, how do you communicate that? And it's a P0 these days. In other words, it is as critical as any other ethics compliance program that a company has. It has to be foundational, particularly for technology companies that are custodying data. But let's face it, every company is custodying data these days, at least your employee data.
Well, and I mean, I'll just say, I mean, it's such a great point. The best time to plan for a crisis is before it happens. And you can't obviously always control a crisis when it happens, but you need to be prepared for it. And I can't echo enough what Scott's saying about the relationship with law enforcement. It's better to have those relationships when you don't necessarily need them, so that your organization knows who to call. It's a friendly. And the other thing that we found incredibly helpful is that sometimes they push information to us. And so if you've got those relationships in place, they will reach out and say, hey, has this happened? And it gives you an opportunity to actually proactively go and look and see, has this happened? Is this something that we need to be thinking about? And you can continually evolve and mature your program based on that feedback.
So one other thing with the FBI, we had a situation where and this happens with a lot of companies, you get subpoenas from law enforcement abroad. And they can be sort of not tailored to something that we normally are used to dealing with. The FBI actually can be incredibly helpful to introduce to the right folks on how to manage that as well. So another advantage there.
Yeah. And your external counsel can be helpful knowing what their clients have seen with their FBI interactions and giving you context and some patterns in terms of how to anticipate and play out that relationship better.
Great. So let's move to the cybersecurity rule proposal. The most controversial part of this proposal is the 4 business day reporting requirement, which would be triggered by the decision by the board or by the company that the cybersecurity breach is material. And there would be no exception from this requirement, such as, for example, national security. So how difficult is this judgment to make in terms of trying to assess whether or not a breach is material, and what is the process for getting to that decision? And more generally, do you have concerns about having to disclose a cybersecurity breach within 4 business days after determining that it's material? I thought what was interesting in the SEC's rule proposal and the proposing release is the SEC talked about how critical it is for there to be 4 business day reporting, but you think, it's 2023. We haven't had 8K reporting of cybersecurity breaches, ever. So how can the SEC now take the position that is absolutely critical for investor protection? But in any event, let's talk about that 4 business day requirement, and more importantly, how do you manage a process that culminates or that ends with a decision that in fact is material to investors?
I think this is super challenging because during the fog of the incident, it is sometimes hard to know how big or how small it might be. And I think all your resources are actually usually directed at containing whatever perceived incident might be. And so trying to actually ensure that you have the right processes in place that are running in parallel, which I think we all will have, to document what your thinking is around how you get to materiality, I think is probably one of the most important things that we can start adding to our playbooks, which is how do you make the assessment around materiality? That assessment, working with outside counsel as well as your internal stakeholders, has to be well documented and consistent across every incident. And so I think that's going to be a big addition. That's how we're working towards it, because during the incident, it can be very difficult to determine at what point does it become material. And I think that's really going to be the tricky piece.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'll put another angle on this, which is, what if the incident is due to a vulnerability in your code? What do? You have to figure this out, which takes some time. You have to create a patch, and then you have to deploy that patch. That takes time. And so if you're reporting in 4 days, it seems very, very, I don't think that's great for stockholders. I don't think it's terrible for customers, and it's horrible for the company. So I think there's some interesting conflicts that need to be worked out. if you read, I think even this morning, CISA with Department of Homeland Security came out with some new sort of thoughts on how they're going to help companies secure their data. There doesn't seem to be a lot of harmony, or perhaps there could be more connection between what different agencies within the government are doing. Because they do feel like they're a little bit at odds, at least from our perspective.
Yeah, I mean, when something like this happens, your number one priority is to protect your customers and protect your business and to contain and respond to the incident. Does that happen within 4 days of your having a sense of the magnitude of it? Maybe, but not always. So I think this is challenging. When you do look at the disclosure, then you want to put a premium on it being, first of all, accurate. Rush disclosures bring with them costs of inaccuracy. You want them to be not counterproductive, and we can imagine situations, one was just described, where if you haven't identified and patched the code, or you haven't otherwise contained the problem, or you can have the hackers themselves, the threat actors, playing games with putting misinformation out there. Disclosures could be counterproductive to the underlying situation. And we were talking about law enforcement earlier. There are plenty of situations where you're engaged with law enforcement responding, and they want you to delay disclosure. Their state laws may encourage and permit a delayed disclosure. How does this interact with that? So I think this is one that we all have concerns about. I think we all understand the beneficial and positive intent behind it, but in operation, I worry about such a rigid disclosure requirement, such a timeline. And the fact of the matter is, companies are going to put their customers and their business first. And if there's something like this, I just worry about how that affects how they think about the materiality and determination when that happens. I'd rather not be in a situation where there's an incentive to fudge around that with companies because you've got a bigger picture in mind. I think you could design a better rule, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this rule proposal is that if you're late in filing the 8K, it does not impact S3 eligibility. And so in many ways, I think companies will have to think, if we have so many reasons not to file now, and the penalty for not filing is at most an SEC enforcement action, weigh that against what's more important probably is business, customers, and protecting your data. So I think a lot of companies could be pressed into making some difficult choices around this filing if, in fact, there is no accommodation that's made in the final rule for these circumstances. I will say, Carrie, I absolutely agree with you. I think contemporaneous documentation of your thought process is critical, because if you have to anticipate being second guessed, I think the challenge will be how do you make those communications privileged to the extent that you can. And of course, everybody's emailing back and forth in real time as the incident unfolds, and a lot of those communications will not be privileged. But in any event, those are just, I think, the challenges that we can foresee. Let's get into climate change. I mean, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room as we sit here in January of 2023, are we all going to be having to face probably one of the most significant compliance burdens and disclosure burdens that we've seen in quite some time, probably not since Section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley and the internal controls attestation have we seen a compliance effort of this magnitude. And unlike 404 was all in the background. The investors were never really aware of what the company was doing because all they saw was that one-page report from the audit firm that looks like the same as it does with every other public company audit report. Here, all of the work is going to be shown in the 10K. And so, although the next session we'll get into the details of the climate change rule proposal, this is jump off of the panel, is what about the rule proposal most concerns you from a general counsel standpoint? Like from my standpoint as a practitioner, as a lawyer, I think about like the financial statement footnote requirement and how are companies supposed to put in internal controls to sort of capture all that data about impacts from climate change or transition that somehow you have to start calculating to see whether or not it hits that 1% threshold. Or what about the requirement of the attestation of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions? So, we can easily foresee in 2023 there will be undoubtedly a final rule of some kind. What about this rule proposal is sort of top of mind for all of you?
I'm happy to start, and looking forward to the conversation on this one. Look, I think we're very fortunate. My company is very supportive of a sustainability and climate change disclosure framework by the SEC and frankly more broadly. We are also very fortunate in that we've been reporting on most of this data for a number of years, since 2008. We've got targets, we've got the TCFD framework, and so there's a lot of really good work that we've been very fortunate to have done. Again, because of the earlier conversation, it really is critical to our purpose and what we do as a company. And so we view ourselves as a sustainability leader in that respect because it's part of our purpose. So I'll just say, from a company perspective, we're supportive. I think to your point, Tom, there are some challenges with it. I'd say for us that the two big ones would be timing of being able to sync up your 10K, which happens very early in the year, with when companies typically have their sustainability and their climate data, which is for a lot of companies more in Q2. And so those dates don't necessarily sync up as they're currently done. So I'd say that's kind of one challenge. And then I'd say secondarily, this notion of Scope 3, and there's a million different ways to measure Scope 3, to report Scope 3. I think companies are at various degrees of maturity around how they, or if they even do, deal with Scope 3. So it'll be interesting to see where the SEC lands as it relates to Scope 3. I think we've been fortunate that they extended the comment period. They seem to be, looking at a variety of different comments that industry is providing, which is great. But ultimately, I think as we see this evolve, and then I'd say finally is talent, right? So going back to the very beginning of the discussion, there's, audit firms, public accounting firms, law firms are all going to have to really build this expertise. And right now, there's a very small percentage of people or a very small number of people that truly have this expertise to be able to support organizations, and we're all going to be fighting for that same talent. And so whether it's internal legal departments or outside law firms or public accounting firms, just the war for talent in this space to get people that are truly either have the expertise or get people up a really steep learning curve quickly, I think will be a challenge.
I mean, for us, it is an imperative. It's a declaration that we made to be net zero in the future with some interim goals that we'll publish soon. So it is sort of part of who we are and our public commitment. I think the issues that I see are Scope 3. One of the bigger considerations is, we have a long tail, as most companies do, of suppliers. And that's going to be tough to get accurate information from those suppliers the further out you go and the smaller those suppliers are. So I think the accuracy of Scope 3 is going to be challenging. The other is, I'm not sure how you quantify some of these issues in your financial statements or even in the footnotes. It's very challenging, and I think until we get some sort of body of information or knowledge or experience, it's going to be hard. I think back to SOX and how it almost feels that large, both for a new reporting muscle as well as some system of controls that allows you to have some confidence in what you're reporting. That just needs to develop, and as we all recall, SOX took a long time, and I think as we report our global impact report, can we put some of this through that process, which we do, but it's not quite perfect. We've had to develop some things outside. So I think there is a good need for all of us to come together and pick one standard and report against it and have a system of controls that works, but it just doesn't feel like we're there yet.
That murkiness is something we've been thinking about as well. I mean, we are also, and I think most companies are, in principle, very supportive of disclosures around this type of impact. And we've been doing a sustainability report for years, and I think a lot of companies have been reporting outside of disclosures on this in various ways and been tracking this. But the details can be challenging. The footnote in the financial footnote requirement that you mentioned as proposed, I think. If your climate and transition costs are in excess of 1% of the affected line item, you have to calculate that. Well, we don't exactly track and monitor those types of costs like that. I think disaggregating those costs as they're envisioning it from other operational costs is challenging. I don't think if you asked everyone to do it today, as Scott was saying, everyone would create the same approach to how they do that. And so that doesn't give you the goal. That doesn't give you a consistent data set that you can compare across companies and make decisions. So there needs to be more clarity and coordination around that to be actionable and to be useful. I'm optimistic we'll get there. I think the goal is good, but there's a lot to be worked out, and it's reflected in the comment letters, and it's reflected in a lot of the conversations, and hopefully ones we'll be having later today.
Well, like Manisha, I think our company has been reporting on this for a really long time as well, and we're obviously very committed to it. I think it will take so much time to actually get to a standard. We've been over so many standards through this. Like, I can't remember all the letters of standards that we've all had to sort of report to around this. But I think once we sort of get to a more one standard that we can all report to, at some point, the data will actually be useful. But I think that's going to take a long time. And we just have to be aware that some of the data is not going to be that useful to compare across. I think we're going to all have to sort of benchmark with each other and figure out how to get outside counsel that can help us with that in order to get to some kind of acceptable standard. That part, I think, is going to be hard.
Yeah, and one thing I think we're going to have to reconcile is the EU directive as well, the EU Sustainability Directive, which is going to apply to probably a number of folks in the room in some way. That's going to be another challenge. So, harmonization. You asked about other agencies that we're dealing with. I'd say just the concept of harmonization around data, around AI, around cyber, around climate is a challenge because we're all global companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think one central sort of dilemma for the SEC, maybe not dilemma, that's probably overstates it, but I think they're looking at a landscape in which all these public companies are already putting out ESG reports. So I think they may be thinking, well, how difficult is it for just to put that same data in a 10K? But of course, that creates so many issues that they, I think, now are just now appreciating through the comment letters. So let's turn to human capital management, because we know that it's on the Reg Flex agenda. And obviously, we've had 2 years of disclosures in response to a principles-based disclosure requirement. And in response to that principles-based disclosure requirement, many companies have been discussing at length their human capital strategy in qualitative terms, but they've been reluctant to disclose data, quantitative data. So as we now see, and we know that I think Commissioner Crenshaw and her Democrat colleague, criticized the SEC in 2020 for not mandating minimum quantitative data. So I think we can expect the SEC, if they are to put forward a rule proposal on human capital management, it will require quantitative data. What concerns, if any, would you have about a rule proposal that requires public companies to disclose quantitative data about the workforce?
I think we are generally in favor of it, and we already do it. I think some of the challenges are, first of all, not every employee reports. It's just not required. So I think that needs to be built into any consideration of a rule. The other piece is, reporting ethnicity outside of the U.S. is kind of an interesting question. We don't do it because when we have locations, the U.S. is by far the most diverse. And so there's some interesting questions that I think we have not thought through, but the SEC maybe could help us think through. And what is the rule? What's the scope of the rule? Is it U.S.-based employees only? Is it global? There are some interesting questions there.
Yeah, I mean, we have the same approach. I mean, fundamentally very much aligned. I mean, we report lots of metrics around, DE&I. We have standards and that we're trying to meet by a certain year, and so we're, big proponents of it, very supportive of it. But again, the issue is the details, right? So as a global multinational company, is it U.S. specific? What does it look like outside of the U.S.? How do you report that? And I think we're, the folks on this stage are very fortunate in that our companies are, far along on this journey. But, if you think across public companies, irrespective of size, it's going to look different for different organizations. And so trying to get a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, may be a challenge.
Yeah, very, very aligned with that. I mean, we report a lot of data. It's part of holding ourselves accountable. It's part of participating in this conversation. But data without context can be easy to misinterpret and draw the wrong conclusions from. And so I think as we're providing it, what does it mean in different regions and in different professional areas? What are trends versus the snapshot? What do you say? Data is very easy to misinterpret without the proper context, and we just want to make sure that whatever we're reporting, we're able to give context to it and explain. And if it's, If it's a great story, great. If it's not where it needs to be, we'll be open about that as well. But how you frame and encourage people to understand the data and consistency across companies is certainly in Silicon Valley. We've seen companies reporting on demographic data in all sorts of ways, which I don't think are always accurate, portrayals of their situation, and you don't want to have just a repeat or magnification of that. So.
Well, it's such an interesting point because really the beauty and the kind of underlying purpose of this is to get organizations to push themselves, to be more inclusive, to have more equity. And so you don't want to sort of over-rotate to where organizations now feel like they can't be on that journey and be transparent about the journey that they're on and the progress that they still need to make. So, you could have made lots of progress, but obviously there's still work to do, and you don't want to somehow, go counter to that overall principle of trying to make organizations feel accountable for continuing to make progress.
Let's switch now to talking about boards and that perennial tension between oversight versus management. What have been the challenges from your standpoint in discussing the SEC's agenda and priorities with your board members? Obviously, a lot of them are also attending director colleges and events, and so the company is not the only source of information about what's going on at the SEC. But from your standpoint as general counsels, when you advise your board members about the agenda at the SEC, what's the feedback you're getting? What are their views as to what management should be doing?
For us, it all goes through our nominating governance committee usually, and also I guess other committees, audit, et cetera. But I think the way that the concerns that they have really are going back to talent. I know talent seems like it's going to be the theme of this conversation, but going back to talent, do we have the talent that we need in order to implement the systems that are going to be required in order to demonstrate compliance? They also want to understand what their role should be with respect to oversight of all this new regulation. For us, the great thing is, for example, on cybersecurity, we have regular OpMecs with our audit committee around cybersecurity, and so we can sort of up those OpMecs and use those OpMecs as the rails to sort of drive some of this oversight. I think they want to understand what their role should be. And I think, again, we all have those challenges of ensuring that we have the right transparency without the involvement in the management of these initiatives. So I think that's a big piece of sort of navigating that with your board, is figuring out how you get full transparency, feedback, and helpful insights without sort of getting too deep into the management of the actual risks.
I'd also say, it's such a great point. The boards these days obviously have to be incredibly sophisticated and manage a number of competing issues, just like management teams are. And so, one of the things that I think boards are spending a lot of time on is their own composition and making sure they've got the right expertise in the boardrooms that they need to call on, whether it's cyber or whether it's ESG or any number of issues. And so there's been a lot of discussion, I think, in boardrooms around composition, succession, making sure that you've got the right skills. DE&I is another one. And then, to Carrie's point, part of our role as general counsel in our law department and our external firms is giving our boards the tools that they need in order to make sure they're focused on the right things. And they're looking to us for that support and guidance. And we need to be prepared to offer views on how the boards should be spending their time and what they should be thinking about.
The good news is boards, at least forward-thinking boards, get it. They understand that these issues are part and parcel with business success, attracting talent, retaining talent. So that's all very positive. I think the questions will be the detail and how they're are they mandated? Are there sort of very narrow areas of reporting, and therefore that's going to sort of change how we actually practice this, which is very company specific. And each of us, even the tech companies up here, probably do things slightly differently because we're different companies. So I think that's a bit of a challenge. And then I think there's just sort of substantive governance overload, which is how many experts can you have on your board when the board really is there to hire and fire the CEO, to manage risk at the highest level, and to help implement or at least envision and ensure strategies implemented. And that becomes very challenging when you have sort of multiple experts and you're trying to keep your board to a manageable size. In our instance, we've very similar to, I think, what has been done at Intuit. We have committees take on a lot of the sort of governance work, and then the board is really reserved for strategy. There's reporting out and up, which is great, and there's some areas like cyber we're going to go deeper into, but for the most part, that structure's worked well. And it actually recently for us, about a year ago, came to the point where cyber is so strategic for us and data responsibility, we formed a separate committee focused just in those areas.
This is where I think board refreshment is so critical. As over the last probably 5 years, we've done a lot of board refreshment and sort of went and have a lot more operating folks like CEOs and operating people on our board. And so they have the experience being in an operating role, understanding the landscape more deeply, I think, than folks who may not be in an operating role or haven't been in an operating role for a while. And so having that board refreshment has been very helpful to us to be able to actually move forward on some of these more complex issues like cybersecurity and AI and governance around those things.
Yeah, and I think the framework that was mentioned of giving them the tools is the right framework. I mean, I think some of them are looking at these requirements and wondering if we're going to operationalize our board in some of these areas, and really much of it is just expanding the scope or evolving the focus of what their oversight is and how they're thinking about strategy. And if they're hearing from and being educated by subject matter experts in terms that even if they lack that expertise themselves, they understand the issues and can effectively exercise that oversight, then I think we've accomplished our goals. And I'm hoping that's where we go in many of these areas, because it is difficult to put subject matter experts and increasingly in increasing numbers of fields on boards directly. That's not necessarily what boards are always for. So that's the trend that we're hoping to see go further.
The SEC's proposed rules on cybersecurity and on climate change focus very specifically on directors. They're asking for more information about expertise and experience. They're asking for how many times the board is dealing with climate change, for example, or how many times management is reporting up to the board on climate change. Do you see the SEC, or do you foresee if there's going to be additional SEC scrutiny on board expertise or director level expertise, and board SEC scrutiny on the number of times you're talking about these issues? Do you see that as impacting the board in some way? I mean, hopefully the board is setting its own agenda, but in some ways you see the SEC trying to set the board's agenda and sort of saying, well, how many times do you talk about cybersecurity? Well, maybe we haven't been talking about it. Should we now be putting it on the board's agenda? To what extent do you see that dynamic happening already?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a balancing act because, again, every company is on a different, on a pretty broad range of spectrum, right? I mean, we're very fortunate that we have a cyber expert on our board. It's top of mind. Climate change is inherent in what we do. I mean, we cool and move and heat water, and so that inherently, for our customers, there's a sustainability piece to it. And so, back to the point around if your purpose and your strategy really anchors on this, it's a little bit more natural for the board to be discussing it than maybe for other companies. And so I think it's a balancing act of obviously trying to make sure that boards are focused on the right things for the company and for its investors and stakeholders, but also, trying to be compliant. Yeah, I think part of it is, as a company, what do you believe the board should be focused on, and how should the board be spending its time, and that should really drive the agenda. And cyber obviously now has to be an important part of it, but it goes back again to the composition of it, where the work gets done. You can do a lot of this work, as Carrie said, in the committees, and so you don't have to kind of suck board time away from things that are important, because the board committees can do a lot of the work of, just think about the audit committee and how much work they do in reviewing the financials and reviewing earnings. It's very similar with things like cyber and climate.
Tom, in this area, I think something more principles-based would be more appropriate than something super prescriptive. How many times did you do this, and what did this look like? And I think something that's, tell us about would be much more appropriate. Because I think we're actually aligned on these issues. They are important for companies, and they're impacting bottom lines ultimately.
Yeah, but whether it's an annual deep dive or a quarterly check or a dedicated committee, it depends on the nature of your business and what your risk profile is.
In the remaining 7 minutes that we have, let's talk now to law firms. In this time of dynamic regulatory change, how can law firms best help you and your colleagues in the legal department. So what works best and why? Maybe you should have started with this question, but as to the many law firms that are here, from your standpoint as GCs, how can law firms best help you deal with all of these regulatory challenges?
Well, I'll start with one, just picking up something I said earlier. I mean, one of the things that's so valuable about law firms is you have all these clients and you see the bigger picture and landscape more quickly and in some ways many ways better than we do. And so when when a new rule is coming down or there's a new requirement, well, how are your clients responding to this? We want to be in good company. We want to have the benefit of best practices, and helping us understand and set that is one of the most valuable things that the law firms with the access to all those different data points can bring to us.
Yeah, and also make sure, and this is obvious, but understand our business and the specific risks that our business is subject to, and try to make sure that you're deep in that with us. Because I think while it is super helpful to have that benchmarking, which is really critical, understanding the deep risks of our business and how that might set us apart or make us different is going to be really important as well.
So I would add, I agree with all of that, including law firm fees that I don't think you mentioned, but I'm going to spread that to you. I think there are areas of operations that we talked about. These laws come into effect, or these regulations, and how do you get that through the organization? Help there would be incredibly valuable to us, because we don't see this at the scale and scope that you do. So understanding, how do you get a communications team to work with you? How do you get your software engineers or your product managers to put it on their roadmap? How do you have conversations with the board or the executive team? Those are super, super valuable, because we have to ultimately operationalize it, and we have to do this cross-functionally. So I would say that's number one. Number two, providing context is really, really helpful. The narrative, help us tell the story to our teams so that this becomes more of a tailwind than legal imposing it, and it's a very turbulent headwind.
And I agree with all of those. I'd say, the only other thing that I might add is just, give me an answer. I recognize that a lot of this stuff is esoteric and there's a million different ways that you could cut at an issue, but ultimately I cannot go to my business leaders and say, here are the 5 things we can do, and here's the 20 risks on each one of them and the pros and cons, and now you go off and figure it out. I have to be able to provide concrete information and recommendations. And look, the business may decide to take it or not take it, but what I can't do is provide, a soliloquy on all the different ways that we handle these issues. So I need my lawyers, both internally and externally, to think like a business leader, put your business leader hat on, and come with solutions that make sense for my business.
Yeah, and that's where knowing the business is so important, and the risk tolerance and with that. And I think, trying to help us get in front of these things and actually sort of put them on the agenda before we actually need to implement them, because the time period within which some of this stuff takes to implement within a company, there's systems, there's people, there's hiring, there's training, there's, it's a long period of time. And so help us get ahead of it so that we can start implementing it so that we're ready when the thing comes out.
I think correspondingly, in terms of wanting advising or having law firms be more helpful to you, I think correspondingly there needs to be some consideration given to your spending more time with your firms and sharing more information with them. I think that will be critical, for example, with climate change. You can't really turn to your outside law firm and say, all right, just draft me the climate change section. You need information.
Totally fair, yeah.
You need to start, collaborating and doing some diligence together before we can then put up a work product. But I do think, yes, you're right, it is going to be very challenging. In terms of what you foresee in 2023, assuming that the SEC is able to reach agreement, what will be the first things that you do to, let's say tomorrow the calendar, the open meeting calendar is announced, and we see that climate change is announced for next Wednesday. What are you starting to do today, knowing that it's actually going to be for next Wednesday? How do you start to think, how do you work with your law firms, not in the abstract, but concretely? Let's sort of assume that we have that type of scenario.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we get a cross-functional group together internally, but I think it's important to bring outside counsel in from the get-go. So they're actually an extension of the team.
Well, and again, on a lot of this, if organizations haven't started preparing for some of this already, you're behind. And so, you know, we've been working on this, we've been preparing for it, and so whatever the go date is, I mean, obviously it's not going to be perfect, but the key is to start, to Carrie's point, planning early, getting ready early, and sort of anticipating, so that whenever the go button is, whenever it's released, you know, you still have lots of work to do, but at least you're already on a path toward, you know, being ready for it.
And that's an excellent point, because you know, if the political capital is there for 3 Democratic commissioners to agree on a rule proposal, that same political capital is there for rule adoption. So in many cases, even though there are significant challenges ahead for the SEC to actually get to a final rule, to have to deal with all of the comment letters, we should assume that the political will is there, so the compliance moment, the gun has already, you know, been shot, so to speak. And so I think the best prepared companies will be thinking, even now, they should have a game plan in place to think and anticipate whether it's next Wednesday or a Wednesday in March, but they need to be ready with their game plan now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are asking, you know, how burdensome is this going to be for companies, and it's going to depend on where you're starting from. And, and we, you know, I don't think it's hard to see where a lot of this is heading, or at least sort of basically where a lot of it will land, and we can be preparing for that now, and the good companies are. And we talked about, you know, building relationships with law enforcement during peacetime. You know, build your relationships with your outside counsel, your internal team, the cross-functional stakeholders before there's something urgent, and then when it happens, it'll be less urgent because you'll be prepared.
And the reality is that even if we hope that a rule in its final form will look very different than the rule proposal, in most cases that really doesn't happen. And so you'll see a rule being, you know, at the margins, we'll see some changes, but in many ways, they've already decided what they want the rule to look like. And in most cases, the rule adoption looks a lot like the rule proposal. So with that, that concludes our first session of the day. Thank you very much to the speakers, and we will reconvene. Thank you. And we will have a 15-minute break and reconvene at 10:30.